1944, Texas Panhandle. The evening sun burns low across the flat plains, stretching shadows through barbed wire. Dust drifts between lines of wooden barracks caught in the slow hum of a generator. On the far end of the compound, a group of American guards unloads rations from a truck. Sacks of flour, sides of beef, and crates of cigarettes marked Lucky Strike. Behind the wire, a dozen men in worn khaki uniforms watch. Japanese soldiers, young, thin, faces hardened by disbelief. They had been told that capture meant torture, starvation, perhaps execution. Yet here the smell of grilled meat fills the air. A corporal steps closer to the mess tent. He hears laughter. The clatter of metal trays. A gramophone crackles to life, spilling out the bright trumpet of Louis Armstrong's Swing That Music. Inside, prisoners with shaved heads and haunted eyes quietly take seats at long wooden tables. An American cook flips steaks on a hot plate and slides them onto trays. The aroma of butter and smoke turns their stomachs upside down. For the first time in years, they are offered seconds. One prisoner whispers, "A dream." Another hesitates before taking a bite. The meat is tender, real. What was supposed to be hell feels impossibly like reprieve, a contradiction that would haunt them long after the war ended. The story of that confusion, and how it came to be, begins far from the Texas plains. By early 1942, Japan's imperial momentum stretched across the Pacific like a storm front. From the ruins of Manila to the jungles of Burma, entire nations fell under its flag. But behind the ferocity of its soldiers stood a weapon unseen on maps, an ideology that held surrender to be worse than death. For generations, the code of Bushidō and the spiritual fuel of Yamato Damashi, the Japanese spirit had shaped every recruit. The Imperial Japanese Army drilled this creed ruthlessly. A captured soldier had disgraced his emperor, his ancestors, and his nation. Propaganda films showed Allied captives mocked as weaklings unworthy of mercy. Surrender was an erasure of self. Thus, when Japan plunged into total war, its troops went forward believing no enemy would grant a quarter, and none should be expected. World War II became not only a clash of armies, but of moral architectures. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Pacific, America confronted a logistical problem that was also quietly moral. By 1943, its sprawling war machine was seizing Axis troops by the tens of thousands. Germans in North Africa, Italians in Sicily, and soon Japanese from the Aleutian Islands, New Guinea, and the Central Pacific. Washington knew captivity wasn't just about holding prisoners. It was about maintaining legitimacy. The United States had signed the 1929 Geneva Convention on the Treatment of Prisoners of War, a treaty Japan had not ratified. American legal planners decided their moral advantage lay in following it to the letter. Brigadier generals and legal officers argued that humane treatment wasn't sentimentality. It was strategy. Treat POWs well, and enemy propaganda would weaken. Word would spread. Surrender might increase. Intelligence could be gathered through trust instead of terror. So, even as the Pacific War grew bloodier, Tarawa, Guadalcanal, Saipan, the War Department quietly mapped out where to house hundreds, later thousands of captured Japanese. Farmland and empty training areas across the Midwest and South were marked for conversion. The Army Corps of Engineers built symmetrical grids of barracks, latrines, and dining halls, faster than the enemy could believe possible. Few officers expected Japanese prisoners to live long in such places. They assumed most would fight to the death. Yet by late 1943, transport ships carrying wounded, shell-shocked survivors began arriving at San Francisco and Seattle. Among them were men pulled from lifeboats after naval battles, airmen who had ditched in the ocean, and soldiers taken unconscious on jungle islands where surrender had been unthinkable. These prisoners, the first of their kind on American soil, found themselves marched into environments that seemed dreamlike. Instead of the cages of their nightmares, they saw clean bunks, laundries, libraries, even small gardens. Guard towers stood at attention, yes, but behind them lay a world of almost bureaucratic civility. Prisoners were registered, given serial numbers, and informed, in translated leaflets, of their rights under the Geneva Convention: adequate rations, medical care, and access to mail. To American guards and administrators, it was routine. To the Japanese prisoners, it was surreal. Some feared trickery. Others waited for hidden cruelty that never came. They whispered to each other that perhaps they were being fattened for execution. Reports from these first camps began filtering to Washington. Japanese soldiers were not resisting. They were bewildered. Their captors were giving them the same meals as U.S. troops, sometimes better. Officers wrote home that it was oddly peaceful, that the men spent quiet afternoons smoking or listening to records distributed by the Red Cross. This calm was deceptive. Behind it lay a war still raging beyond the Pacific horizon. Every steak, every cigarette handed out under the Texan or Iowan sun was an echo of a distant inferno, from the ruins of Nanking to the burning decks off Leyte Gulf. And yet, even as new POW shipments arrived from the Pacific and camp systems expanded, that small, improbable island of humanity within global barbarism took root. It was the beginning of something more complex than comfort, a psychological experiment unfolding in real time. By mid-1944, the American prisoner of war network had matured into a continent-sized machine. From the humid Gulf Coast to the snowy line of Wisconsin and Minnesota, more than 500 camps were strung across the landscape like quiet reflections of the globe at war. Their barbed wire perimeters contained not only captured Axis soldiers, but an experiment in controlled humanity. Among them were the Japanese compounds, far fewer than the German or Italian camps, yet burdened with deeper cultural tension. Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, Camp Clarinda in Iowa, Camp Kenedy, and Camp Huntsville in Texas. Ordinary towns of white picket fences now held by men once devoted to the Emperor's conquest. Most were brought there through the long logistical arteries of the U.S. Navy, from the bloody beaches of Saipan or the wreckage of naval encounters, to Honolulu, then to the American mainland. They arrived in silence. The Americans would notice how these prisoners averted their gaze, refusing to meet the eyes of their guards. Many had been told by their own army that capture meant ceremonial death. Yet instead of execution, they were issued fatigue-stamped PW, shown the mess schedule, and ushered toward kitchens fragrant with coffee and frying meat. The camps followed regulations down to the ounce. The ration pattern prescribed by Washington matched the diet of U.S. troops, roughly 3,700 calories daily, with occasional fresh fruit and, astonishingly, small luxuries. Cigarettes were distributed through canteens. Red Cross parcels added chocolate and soap. Each camp maintained a supply of band instruments and books to limit idleness. Work details in nearby fields supplemented. Local labor shortages under tight supervision. A carefully managed service for pay, forbidden to approach anything resembling forced labor. Guard detachments enforced discipline lightly but visibly. Inside the wire, daily life organized itself into routines that to some of the prisoners felt like hallucination. Roll call at dawn, breakfast of eggs or oatmeal, mid-morning work, then recreation. Baseball for those willing, sketching or reading for others. In Texas, swing music blared from mess hall radios meant for the Americans, the rhythms carrying through open windows to ears that had only known military marches. Inspection tours by representatives of the International Red Cross confirmed the strangeness. Reports filed from 1943 through 1945 describe Japanese detainees astonished by the fairness of treatment. Some prisoners began corresponding with American pen pals and church volunteers who wrote letters of kindness, gestures so alien, they broke the psychological barriers built since childhood. This humane facade was not without calculation. The U.S. Psychological Warfare Branch and the Office of War Information quietly encouraged generous policies. Humane treatment was a weapon stronger than any rifle. A well-fed, well-treated prisoner could be debriefed with patience rather than pain. The information gathered from friendly conversations in mess halls and hospital wards proved far more reliable than that extracted through threat. Yet to the prisoners themselves, each meal, each note of jazz carried deep confusion. Lieutenant Commander Tadamichi Kuribayashi's men on Iwo Jima had perished to preserve Japan's honor. Here their fellow soldiers were polishing boots and learning English slang from guards who called them Mac. Those early experiences became seeds of contrast. Word trickled back through newly captured soldiers in the Pacific. Whispers that American camps were places of food, medicine, and even laughter. Military police transcripts later recorded that some Japanese began doubting their commanders' portrayals of Western brutality. In the cautious minds of American strategists, that small crack in fanaticism mattered as much as a naval victory. By 1945, nearly 6,000 Japanese prisoners lived within these ordered spaces, self-contained worlds balanced between war and peace. The nightly calm of jazz on the radio was punctuated by the faraway thunder of a war they could still picture, but no longer touch. And gradually, within those fences, a question grew louder than the music. If the enemy was capable of compassion, what did that say about everything they had believed? That doubt, fragile, ideological, and deeply human, forms the core of the next chapter, the personal and strategic angles of this quiet front. For Japanese soldiers steeped in the martial ethics of Bushidō, capture itself was a spiritual annihilation. They expected humiliation, torture, starvation, perhaps exhibition as trophies of Allied victory. When their transports reached American shores and they were escorted not into cages but into towns with movie theaters and schools nearby, it was as if they'd slipped into a universe that contradicted every value the military had taught them. In letters later reviewed by occupation authorities, some prisoners struggled to articulate the dissonance. They described the camps as peaceful as temples, bewildered that young American guards joked, sang, and treated them like equals in fatigue rather than victors or monsters. The shock was amplified each mealtime. Newspapers from the era show menus identical to those of the U.S. Army. Breakfast with pancakes and coffee, dinner with stew or steak. One historian noted that Japanese prisoners consumed more protein per day in an American camp than an average soldier still fighting in the Pacific. For men conditioned by rationing and hunger, these meals were moral riddles. To eat their enemy's food and enjoy it felt nearly treasonous. Yet hunger has no ideology. They ate and slowly they began to talk. A few laughed at the guards' slang. Others tried their first cigarette coughing amid laughter. And somewhere between steak smoke and swing records flickering through loudspeakers, the stereotype of the barbaric foreigner began to crumble. That collapse of myth was precisely the unspoken goal of America's prisoner policy. Humanitarian as it appeared, the generosity of American camps carried a deliberate undertone. Officials in the War Department understood the psychological theater behind rice bowls and jazz. As early as 1943, internal memoranda framed comfort as an investment in cooperation. The logic was stark. A prisoner who felt safe would talk. At Camp Kenedy, Texas language officers practiced the friendly approach, inviting compliant detainees to special dinners or English classes. Intelligence reports confirmed that this technique yielded richer information on Japanese supply routes, morale, and command habits than coercion ever could. Captives volunteered details casually, embedded in gossip or nostalgia. Behind every free cigarette stood a subtle calculus of war. Still, many American officers enforced these policies with authentic conviction rather than sinister cunning. They believed that civilization, tested in war, proved itself through compassion. Colonel James Thompson, a camp commander later interviewed by the New York Times, said simply, "If we act like savages, we become them." Yet the optics baffled portions of the American public, who read newspaper columns about enemy soldiers playing baseball while ration cards limited civilian sugar. Letters flooded newspapers asking why enemies were living better than some farmhands. The government replied that strict adherence to the Geneva Convention safeguarded American POWs in enemy hands, though few realized Japan rarely reciprocated. So, each steak served under fluorescent lights became both nourishment and message. America would fight ferociously on the battlefield, but would not abandon its ideals inside the wire. That quiet transaction of decency, one cigarette, one steak, one saxophone note at a time, shifted the boundaries of what warfare could mean. But life behind those fences contained other dimensions: labor, learning, and subtle transformations of loyalty that reached far beyond the mess hall. The days inside American camps were long, structured, and oddly normal. After breakfast and roll call, many Japanese POWs joined controlled work detachments in nearby fields or factories, pruning orchards, harvesting crops, repairing roadbeds. The War Manpower Commission saw them as quiet reinforcements for a nation whose young men were busy overseas. Where German prisoners sometimes balked at farm labor, Japanese POWs often embraced it as a form of regained dignity, Reports from Camp McCoy describe immaculate rows of turned soil and impromptu garden patches behind barracks, cultivated with care that echoed home village life. American supervisors, surprised by their discipline, began leaving simple tasks unsupervised. Some prisoners even constructed ornate stone bridges or carved wooden furniture, shaping beauty in the heart of captivity. Afternoons were devoted to education. The Army and Red Cross distributed textbooks, and camp libraries carried English primers with handwritten translations. A handful of civilian educators lectured on democracy, literature, and post-war reconstruction, partly moral instruction, partly political inoculation. To the astonishment of their instructors, students debated politely, learning phrases like freedom of thought and rule of law. For some, it was their first unfiltered encounter with Western intellectual life. In one diary smuggled home after the war, a prisoner wrote simply, "Work makes the heart steady. English makes the world larger." Those routines eroded old certainties more efficiently than any interrogation could. Beneath the calm surface of routine, the U.S. military's intelligence officers observed every laugh, every casual conversation. The Joint Intelligence Center Pacific Ocean areas and the Strategic Services Unit both understood that truthful information was best, harvested in an atmosphere of trust. Interrogators trained in rapport techniques, shared meals with selected prisoners, asked about family, homeland, and books. One linguist, Navy Lieutenant John S. Burton, later testified that the most valuable naval order of battle data came from spontaneous talk over cigarettes rather than formal questioning. He called it intelligence by kindness, where brutality silences, courtesy loosens tongues. The paradox wasn't lost on analysts. Benevolence itself became a weapon, but it also humanized the enemy. Guards who once saw Japanese troops as faceless foes now exchanged newspaper clippings and photographs. Even amid a total war defined by racial propaganda, small islands of mutual recognition formed. Still, Washington insisted on discretion. The humane standard had limits. Security came first. Escape attempts, though rare, were punished firmly, and ideological schooling by die-hard militants was swiftly curtailed. Yet the overall character of these camps remained closer to small towns than military prisons, in the design choice reflecting faith not only in law but in human conscience. While Japanese prisoners slept on clean mattresses under watchful yet uncruel guards, American POWs in the Pacific suffered a harsher fate. Reports from Bataan, Changi, and the Burma-Thailand Railway described starvation, beatings, and executions. When these stories eventually circulated among Japanese captives in the United States, disbelief turned to shame. This contrast became the great moral mirror of the Pacific War. The United States had applied the Geneva Convention even to an opponent that ignored it. Deliberate test of principle under fire. For Japan's defeated soldiers, the experience was transformative. Interviews conducted years later by Japanese scholars revealed that many ex-POWs returned home, convinced that their captors' restraint was proof of an ethical power Japan had denied. For American policymakers, the same comparison fortified national identity. In international broadcasts and post-war propaganda, the U.S. could point to its treatment of prisoners as a validation of democratic values. Compassion became political capital, soft power forged in barbed wire. Within those camps, ideology cracked not with explosions but with the mundane rhythm of decency. Each act of fairness chipped away at decades of conditioning until even the staunchest loyalist could feel the tremor of doubt. That simmering transformation would find its test in the war's final convulsion, the moment when victory, surrender, and memory collided. Summer 1945. The world was ending in slow motion for Imperial Japan. Cities burned like paper from Tokyo to Nagasaki. The home islands were encircled. Inside American camps half a world away, Japanese prisoners awoke to rumors that their empire no longer had a sky. At Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, a drizzling rain mixed with the metallic smell of soil after thunder. Prisoners stood in mourning formation when the loudspeaker cracked with the news. Germany had surrendered in May. Some stared blankly. A European war ending meant little. But by August, whispers spread that Japan itself had been hit by a single bomb that erased entire cities. Hiroshima, Nagasaki. words passed in disbelief. Then the broadcast from Tokyo, Emperor Hirohito's surrender speech, his voice heavy and trembling, announcing abhorrence of the unbearable. The guards stopped the loudspeaker out of respect. For 30 seconds the camp was silent. Men who had refused to bow since capture folded into themselves on the muddy ground. Others wept without sound, uniforms darkened by rain. One officer later remembered the moment as sinking through the floor of existence. For the Americans, the announcement meant the end. For their captives, it meant a second captivity, ours of conscience. The belief that dying for the emperor was the ultimate honor had no place left to stand. Everything drilled into them, loyalty, invincibility, divine mission, evaporated before the simple fact that they had survived while countless compatriots had not. Camp chaplains were instructed to offer translators to explain what surrender meant, not annihilation, but transition. Yet those words turned like knives. In Japanese thought, surrender had no translation without shame. Many requested to work longer hours, to divert their thoughts through labor. Others flooded the camp's small chapel, not to pray but to sit in silence. Across dozens of U.S. installations, similar scenes unfolded. Interpreters observed how prisoners began dissecting fragments of radio broadcasts, trying to understand how the incomprehensible had happened, how America, once imagined as decadent and weak, had become unstoppable and magnanimous in victory all at once. It was at this moment of spiritual collapse that the American policy of humanity revealed its sharpest edge. Historian Alan Austin wrote that, to a man stripped of every certainty, kindness becomes the most devastating weapon. The stake. Dinners, the open smiles, the music that had once seemed so bewildering now took on a haunting meaning. America's warmth was not an illusion. It was reality. And that reality undercut every myth the militarists had built. U.S. officers sensed this shift. They organized discussion circles, part psychological aid, part quiet triumph. In Texas, interpreters led talks about democratic ideas, the rebuilding of Japan, even baseball. Prisoners listened not as resistors but as people newly adrift. Yet the transformation was uneven. Hardliners still clung to imperial symbols, refusing to believe broadcasts until photographs of atomic ruins arrived through the Yomiuri Shimbun, reprinted in American papers allowed past censors. When they saw the images, a flattened city that had once been Hiroshima Castle, disbelief gave way to horror. For many, the end of the war began not with the emperor's voice, but with that first photograph across a mess hall table. Some fainted. Others confessed that their first instinct was to beg forgiveness from the same guards they had once regarded with contempt. The camps entered a strange twilight. Officially, the prisoners were now simply surrendered personnel. The United States had achieved the rarest outcome in total war, an enemy's psychological capitulation paired with respect. Inside those quiet compounds, the last phase of the conflict would no longer be measured in bombs or bullets, but in the slow, painful rearranging of minds facing a future they could never have imagined. The emotional aftershock of that surrender, and the deeply human exchanges that followed, would define the true climax of captivity, the decision of how to go home. When the official surrender reached every camp, the war's geography collapsed into memory. The flags were lowered, rifles stacked, and a new uncertainty filled the silence. An imperial soldier who once swore to die for the emperor now faced a different kind of courage, returning home alive. At Camp Kenedy, chaplains noted that prisoners lined up voluntarily to listen to recordings of the surrender broadcast again and again. They sat cross-legged on the floor, notebooks resting on their knees, trying to understand every word of the emperor's unprecedented voice. For many, it was the first time they had heard him speak. Mythology turned human in a few wavering sentences. Some wept, not for loss, but for the revelation that he too could sound mortal. With the fighting finished, the U.S. War Department issued new directives: maintain discipline, prevent despair, and prepare for repatriation under Operation Magic Carpet. Yet before ships could sail, thousands of prisoners had to be re-educated and medically cleared. Films about Japan's destruction and reconstruction were screened in camp theaters. narrated soberly by American instructors. What had started as a program for morale became a bridge between enemies. The transition was not simple. Superiority and guilt fought within each man. Guards recorded nights when prisoners gathered in candle-lit circles, performing memorial ceremonies for fallen comrades. A quiet song would rise, not defiant, not joyful but mournful, carried on the soft whine of Texas wind. Jazz, once a jarring intrusion, became accompaniment to grief. A guard recalled standing outside a barrack as prisoners listened to a record of Benny Goodman. "It was strange," he said later. They understood the sadness hidden in the swing. In those months, the camps resembled small laboratories of reconciliation. Captains who once interrogated men for military secrets now helped them pen letters to families in bombed-out towns. The Red Cross mediated the first mail exchanges, short, trembling sentences crossing the Pacific with uncertain destinations. Alive, safe, returning soon. Yet even as plans for repatriation intensified, some prisoners dreaded the voyage. To go home meant facing a society that might see them as cowards, not survivors. The American guards could release their bodies, but not their shame. Military psychologists observed incidents of self-punishment, fasting, ritual apology, obsessive work, a private penitence for not dying with honor. The Army's solution was exposure to the same ideals that had built the camps: structure, trust, choice. Prisoners were allowed to elect camp representatives, organize farewell concerts, and select books to take aboard their transport ships. One of the last performances held in Camp McCoy in October 1945 featured a mixed band of Americans and Japanese playing "When the Saints Go Marching In." It wasn't triumphal, it was strangely peaceful. Listeners described it as a funeral for hatred. When the first ships departed from San Francisco and Seattle in early 1946, rows of men lined the decks. Each wore an issued wool coat and carried a duffel bag marked JP. From the pier came the sound of military band music, the same brassy optimism that had once startled them behind the wire. Now it made sense, the rhythm of life continuing forward. As the coast disappeared behind fog, many prayed, not simply to the emperor, but for understanding. They left America with stomachs still unsettled by rich food and minds reshaped by paradox. The enemy had fed them, healed them, even befriended them. In that contradiction lay the true theater of surrender. The Battle of the Pacific had ended months before, but in the quiet of those departing ships, a different war still raged: the fight to reconcile survival with honor. And as Japan awaited its son's return, the United States prepared to dismantle the very camps that had revealed so much about both nations' souls. That dismantling, physical and moral, became the first chapter of what came after. By the spring of 1946, the network of POW camps that had once dotted the American interior began folding like a closing map. The barbed wire came down first. Then the barracks were sold to farmers or converted into makeshift housing for veterans returning from Europe. The war was over, materials were scarce, and pragmatism reigned. But for the men now boarding Liberty ships under repatriation orders, these departures were not merely logistical. They were existential. When Japanese POWs stepped onto the gangways, at Seattle and San Francisco, they carried a few possessions: a change of clothes, some English books, perhaps a small souvenir carved during detention. Some clutched snapshots with American guards, a gesture that baffled inspectors who couldn't easily categorize friendship between former enemies. On deck, they stared at the coastline, unsure whether to feel relief or dread. They were going home to a land they barely recognized, its cities leveled, its emperor's divinity renounced, and its people surviving on rations thinner than those inside American camps. The irony cut deep. A sergeant from Camp Clarinda later told an interviewer, "We ate meat in Texas. My family ate weeds in Kumamoto." The voyage itself lasted weeks, a slow crossing punctuated by drills for hygiene and quarantine. Red Cross. Volunteers provided reading materials, sometimes magazines full of post-war optimism, sometimes pamphlets about reconstruction. Translators on board heard men practicing new English words like democracy and future, rolling the syllables as if declaring small acts of hope. Back in Japan, receiving officials from the repatriation ministry registered returning POWs with clinical efficiency, but cold emotion. They were labeled senbotsu ni arazu, not dead in battle, a category that carried subtle stigma. Many families met them with complex mixtures of joy and shame. Some wives bowed deeply, yet avoided eye contact. Neighbors whispered. To have returned alive from foreign captivity meant carrying an invisible burden. In the months that followed, former prisoners scattered throughout the shattered islands. A few found work assisting U.S. occupation authorities as interpreters, applying their fluent English and understanding of American customs. Others withdrew into silence. Diaries uncovered decades later reveal how some could not shake the sensory memory of American abundance. The smell of steak fat hissing on metal grills, the sweetness of canned peaches, the haunting cheer of brass instruments floating through night air. American officials, meanwhile, documented the program's legacy with bureaucratic detachment. Reports from the Provost Marshal General concluded that adherence to humanitarian standards had strengthened U.S. global reputation and provided intelligence of significant strategic value. Yet beyond the reports lay the human residue of the policy. Guards who remembered their prisoners with affection, and civilians who realized that the world beyond their fences was not divided neatly into villains and heroes. At Camp McCoy's closure ceremony, officers lowered the flag as a small group of remaining detainees watched. According to eyewitness accounts, one prisoner quietly saluted, not in mockery but respect. A guard returned the gesture. In that brief exchange, the conflict that had once spanned oceans compressed into a single motion of mutual acknowledgement. When the last POW train pulled away from Wisconsin toward the coast, the tracks gleamed under spring rain. Behind it lay empty barracks and the lingering echo of music from a radio left on inside the deserted mess hall. Yet the story didn't end when those trains vanished over the horizon. It lived on in what both nations chose to remember, and what they preferred to forget. When the prisoners finally reached Japan, the shock went both ways. For years, families had been told that those who surrendered were as good as dead. Now phantom sons stepped off ships onto ruined docks, tanned from the Texas sun, eyes clearer than expected. Many locals turned away, unable to bridge reality with propaganda. In the confusion of rebuilding, these returnees drifted to the margins, some forming quiet associations of former POWs, others dedicating themselves to agriculture or education, seeking meaning through creation rather than conquest. American occupation officials watched closely. To them, these men were living case studies, proof that exposure to Western freedoms could moderate former imperial subjects. Reports noted that returned prisoners often rejected militarist dogma and became advocates for reconciliation. A few entered public service or journalism, describing America not through bitterness but reluctant admiration. Among them was a soft-spoken former petty officer who later confessed on radio, "I learned democracy behind barbed wire." Within the United States, the legacy of the camps evolved just as strangely. In small towns where POWs had worked, farmers remembered them as diligent helpers. Decades later, residents of Iowa and Texas still recalled Japanese prisoners who built irrigation ditches or repaired barns. Newspaper retrospectives from the 1960s carried photographs of former guards shaking hands with visiting ex-POWs, gray-haired men smiling awkwardly beside now rusted fences. The tone was gentle disbelief that such civility had occurred during humanity's most uncivilized moment. Historically, the policy's success strengthened American confidence in moral warfare. The argument that ideals, if lived sincerely, could serve as strategy. During the Cold War, that principle shaped U.S. information campaigns from Korea to Vietnam. The notion that decency itself could be weaponized. Yet within Japan, the memory was more conflicted. For some veterans, American kindness remained a wound, proof that their indoctrination had betrayed them. For others, it was liberation from the prison of myth. Scholars later traced subtle lines from those experiences to Japan's post-war pacifism. Diaries and oral histories show that many ex-POWs became teachers or community leaders who quietly preached tolerance. They carried into public life an understanding of foreignness once defined by hatred. now replaced by curiosity. In that sense, the barbed wire classrooms of Wisconsin and Texas contributed, indirectly but profoundly, to the moral reinvention of a nation. Time, as always, softened the edges. The camps became farmland again. The wooden barracks rotted into soil. On anniversaries, local historians placed small plaques noting that Axis prisoners of war were held here. 1943-1946, no mention of steak or jazz, yet the echoes persisted, in family stories, in faded photographs of strange camaraderie. For those who had lived the experience, memory worked like two mirrors facing each other. Americans saw the reflection of their better selves, disciplined mercy amid rage. The Japanese saw the reflection of a universe larger than their empire had ever allowed. Across decades, some exchanged letters, now written in shaky handwriting, still signing off with, "Your friend." And so the camps that began as instruments of security ended as laboratories of empathy. The war that sought to erase humanity had, in small pockets, proved its endurance. From that endurance came the final lesson, one that transcends victory or defeat. In the ruins of the most violent century, the strangest triumph was not a victory of firepower, but of restraint. Barbed wire had divided enemies, yet within those boundaries decency outlasted rage. The experience of Japanese prisoners in American hands exposed an unsettling truth, that sometimes the most powerful act in war is not destruction, but dignity. The contrast could not have been sharper. One side built camps where jazz floated through windows. The other relied on fear and obedience until its own empire collapsed under their weight. Between those extremes stood individual men, frightened, hungry, bewildered, discovering that the world was more complex than slogans on either side of the ocean allowed. Historians now read the records and see administrative efficiency, Geneva Convention clauses, nutritional charts. But beneath the paperwork lies a quieter story. The moment a prisoner first bit into unfamiliar food and realized his enemy wanted him to live. That taste, simple and humane, loosened ideas more deeply ingrained than any chain. In the years that followed, some former captives built bridges in classrooms, on farms, in diplomacy. They embodied a paradox learned behind fences. Compassion can end a war more completely than an armistice. And for America, the lesson was equally sharp. Morality is a weapon that gains strength only when used without vengeance. Today, the remnants of those camps are little more than wind over grass. Yet if you listen, you can almost hear the faint echo of a trumpet, a wisp of laughter through the static of an old record. The sound carries the memory that even in humanity's darkest era, someone still turned on a gramophone instead of raising a gun, and proved that mercy, too, can march in time.